Okay, so we're on Samach Vav Amen Aleph, and around the middle of the page, we started a discussion on a concept that's called asmachta. So an asmachta is a statement that you make so that someone should rely on it, but you're not really serious about it. Okay, so in other words, in the law, we call that puffing. In other words, you're not telling a lie, you're just puffing, you're just, either building yourself up or doing something that someone should rely on, but you don't really need the underlying words. That's the concept of asmachta. And there's a machlokes whether asmachta kanya or asmachta lo kanya. So the predominant view is asmachta lo kanya, but so we started it last week. We had a very interesting discussion. I know Michael was involved, he's not here. But in order to really get into this, I just want to go back and repeat what we said at the very end of last week, and that's the beginning of the sugya. So the sugya starts Omarav Huna. It's after the two dots. I would say a little bit beyond halfway on the first word of the sentence of the line. Omarav Huna.
What daf was it?
Sorry, Samach Vav Amud Aleph.
Menashe, I think Michael wants to do some refuah.
Michael's here?
Yeah.
He's
sorry, I'm late. Thank you, Jay. Aryeh Ben Sima.
Aryeh Ben Sima.
Chanalea Basara.
Chanalea Basara.
Chavanomi Basdorachana.
Chavanomi Basdorachana.
Shalom Avraham Ben Kela Gittel.
Shalom Avraham Ben Kela Gittel.
Avigal Rishona Basara Rachel.
Avigal Rishona Basara Rachel.
Chava Pearl Bas Chayesara.
Chava Pearl Bas Chayesara.
Chayesara
Bas Rose.
Gilu Shoshana Bas Libichana.
Gilu Shoshana Bas Libichana.
And Marissa Bas
Tobi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, Michael, you're all dressed up for the Jet game, right?
Yes.
My grandson called me from New York. I'm in Florida. My grandson called. He says, "Ida, you think if we could, maybe I can come down and we can go see the Jet game?" So I said to him, "I'm number one in Florida, and I'm not sure you want to make that trip, and then have to go back for a few hours the way you feel." All right. Anyway, it's all good. Okay. So Michael, to your points last week, because we discussed this whole Indian. So I'm going to go over it and try to sort of summarize it, and then move on and pick up from where we left off. So the Indian of asmachta is, in this particular case, we have a Mishnah, and the Mishnah says that if a person borrows money from somebody else, and he pledges, he says, you know what? Oh, so the condition is the lender says, I'm going to lend you $100 and you have 3 years to pay me back. That's the lashon of the Mishnah. 3 years to pay me back. And if you don't pay me back in 3 years, then this field that you're pledging for the loan reverts to me. Now, the question there is, the field was worth much more than the loan. So when the borrower said to the seller, I'm going to pledge this field, it's the borrower who said, I'm going to pledge this field. And the lender says, okay, I'll give you 3 years to pay it, and then you'll pay me back or I'll take the field. So in reality, the borrower is enticing the lender to make a loan to him because he's got a valuable asset, he's got a field, and the lender will feel comfortable knowing that his loan is secure because he knows. I mean, look, you lend him 100 in cash, he wants to pay him back in cash, but if not, I have a field. Not only do I have a field, I have a field worth much more than the actual loan. So that's the source of the discussion of asmachta, whether or not the borrower making the statement to the lender that I have a field that I can give you a security and this field is worth far more than the loan, whether or not he means it. In other words, does he really mean to give the guy a field back worth much more than the loan? Or is he saying it in order to make the lender feel comfortable to make the loan because there is an asset from which he can recover, but he didn't really mean to give him a piece of land that's worth far more than the loan? So that's the discussion of asmachta. That's an example of an asmachta where the borrower is making that statement here, here's my field. So we started talking last week and we said, so Rav Huna says there is a difference between when you say the commitment. For instance, if I lend you, Michael, $100, and in the course of that loan, b'shas ma'aseh, meaning in real time, we discuss the repayment, and the repayment is a field, and the field is worth much more money. So because I did it in real time, says Rav Huna, that in that particular case, the asmachta is kanya because he could have negotiated at the time and said something different. He could have said, I'll give you half a field or some other condition. The fact that he said, here's my field, then Rav Huna says it's more than just speech. It's more than just making the fellow comfortable. It's actually a commitment to give it. Now, this sugya, just to take a step back, this sugya is on the heels of the previous sugya where, and I'm not going to go into the sugya, but just to show you the parallel, where in the previous sugya, we were talking about whether or not if you make a statement, pitume mile, is it just words or is there conviction? And we had several examples, the case where a person was on his deathbed and he divorced his wife and she said, don't worry, I'm here for you. Does that mean that the divorce is, the get is not a get? So this, on the heels of that discussion, this Gemara wants to talk about asmachta, which is not identical, but similar in that you're saying something that you don't really mean. You know, I don't mean to give you a field worth twice, three times the price of the loan, but I'm doing it to induce you. So says Rav Huna, if it's made b'shas matan mos, kana hakol, then the lender acquires the whole thing if 3 years pass and he doesn't give him the money, repay the loan. But la'acher matan mos, what happens if they conducted a deal and there was no discussion about this collateral? He lent them the money, and then now you can ask, why would there be a subsequent discussion? You know, the borrower sees the lender all the time in shul, and he feels uncomfortable because there's a loan outstanding. So he goes over to the lender and says, Yankel, don't worry, I have a field, and if something happens, then you'll be able to get money from the field. So he does it spontaneously, but after the loan. So then what do we say? Says Rav Huna, Lo kana ela keneged ma'osav. In that particular case, he truly meant to make the lender comfortable. Therefore, his commitment is for the amount of the loan. If the land is worth far more than the loan, then there is no obligation to give him the entire field. He can give him either part of the field or sell the field for money and give him part of the money. But so he makes the chilek as to when it was said in time, as to what the seriousness of the statement. That's Rav Huna's view. Now, I know we talked last week, a lot of questions, what's the halacha, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to get to that in a minute. But the point of the matter is that we see that an asmachta, really asmachta lo kanya. Asmachta isn't kanya. But Rav Huna says where you say it in real time, it is kanya. He's not conceding that asmachta is kanya. which is we'll see that Machlokus shortly. But he's saying Asmach the Lo Kanya, which is the majority view, but under certain circumstances, you are obligated to make that payment depending on when you set it in time, because the argument is that the lender would not have made the loan if he didn't have the comfort of knowing that he's got a repayment in place. Okay, that's Rav Huna's view.
Excuse me,
And,
Rabbi.
okay, that's what we stopped last week. Now, we're going to answer some of the questions that we discussed, but let's go a little bit further.
Just one short question, Rabbi.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, this whole discussion is really sort of on the surface. I think it sounds like the real issue is what are the intentions of the two parties,
Correct.
not whether the words are perfectly one way or another way. So why isn't the Gemara discussing this in terms of intentions? Because intentions is another whole category when it comes to tefillah, this or that. It's a big
Right.
area, intentions.
Right. But the question is, Jay, how do we read somebody's mind? How do we know what they intended here by making that statement? You can argue it every which way, so we don't know intentions. So the Rav Huna says the way to establish what his intention was is to look at the circumstances and the timing of the words in relation to the loan. So that's his answer. His answer is his intentions will be proven by when he made the statement. If he made the statement at the time the loan was made, then other than knowing what he really thinks, we say that he meant it. He meant to give him the land. He was so sure that he'll repay the money in 3 years that he feels comfortable. I mean, sometimes you feel, you make a bet, okay? You bet on something. And all right, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm willing to make the bet. And sometimes you say, I'm making this bet because I'm 1,000% sure, and you want to take the bet, fine, but I'm going to win this bet. Now, maybe most of the time you win and sometimes you make a mistake. But the question is, without knowing someone's interior in his mind, what he's thinking, we have to look at the circumstances and say, this is what he was thinking. So Rav Huna is saying that while asmachta lo kanya, but if you say to the lender, I'm going to give you this property, then we infer that he meant it. Again, how much more can we get into that by saying, no, he didn't mean it? Why would you say he didn't mean it? So Rav Huna takes the position that there were alternatives for the borrower. He could have said something different. He could have said, I'll give you part of the land, or I'll repay you in cash, notwithstanding. But the fact that he said, here's the land, and the land will be yours if I don't pay you in 3 years, his intention was, I'm going to repay this, but if not, I'm going to give you the land. So Rav Huna says there's no way to get out of that thought process, because otherwise, ein l'davar sof. How will we ever know what someone is saying, if it's true, if it's not true? So we have to have some reason to believe him, and we believe him because it was said at the time of the loan. However, if it's not said at the time of the loan, then there's no issue, because no one ever committed anything. Then if the borrower says to the seller, here's my land, then we can really infer that he's, maybe the guy was asking him every other day, are you going to pay me? Are you going to pay me? So he says, don't worry, I got a field, don't worry. But that clearly was not meant to be the mashkin, the pledge for the loan. It was more like, get off my back. Here, there's a piece of property, don't worry about it. So says Rav Huna, then his actual intention was not to give him the land. It was really, don't bother me. So he makes that point. Therefore, if in fact it comes to pass that he can't pay him back in cash, then you can't impute that what he meant was, I'm going to give you the land. Because we have to interpret his intention as not being, I'm going to give you back the land. I'm only going to give you a return of your loan. because he had no obligation to say anything after the loan was made, right? I mean, after the loan was made, we made a deal. Now you want to come forth either because you feel bad and you want to say something to him, or because the guy is, you see him in shul and you look at him and you're uncomfortable, or he's bothering you. I mean, those are all okay circumstances for which you can ignore, or you can say something. Here, the say something was, here's my field, they'll take my field, but the field is worth so much more money. Says the Gemara, says Rav Huna, Ella keneged ma'osav, you can only take the field up to the amount of the loan. All right, so that's Rav Huna's position. And okay, that's his statement. So now, in order to go further and understand, there is a differing opinion. Rav Nachman says, now look, he is much more machmir. Afilu la'acher matan mos kona hakol. Rav Nachman says that if I make the statement to you and I say, after we made the loan, and I'm the borrower, and I say, here I have a field, and this field I'm pledging, and the field is worth far more than the loan, then according to Rav Nachman, that is that loan is pledged, and he's chayiv to give him the whole loan. So now so we're set here. We see that, and Rav Nachman takes the position, you know what? This isn't a smachta, and a smachta lo kanya, but because someone makes a statement like that to say that I'm going to pledge my entire field, he says that's an exception to the asmachta. The asmachta usually, okay, it's not meant to be serious. But here, in this particular case, he said it's meant to be serious, not only when it's done at the time of the loan, but even after the loan. So we have a machlokes, certainly at the time of the loan, everybody agrees that it's a commitment. The machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Nachman is if he says the commitment after he makes the loan, whether or not, how do we look at that? So according to Rav Huna, it's not serious, but I mean, you can't hold him to taking the entire field, certainly the amount of the loan. And Rav Nachman says, no, it's more than that. Okay, so that now we have the machlokes set. And now Gemara is going to go into some detail here, and we're going to see the nuances back and forth.
Yeah, had somebody then, the Besdin or whatever, said, look, this is the procedure in this business. If you say something, you have to declare a backup, a way that you'll get your money back. I mean, if they made a rule that you have to do something at the time of a loan, that you have to declare what the collateral is, then that would solve all these problems for people. Why didn't they step in? And that's my question. Why did they step in and say, look, this is a great story here in the Gemara. It's a good question, but we don't need this. Just make a ruling that when you're making a loan, there has to be certain statements made so that everybody is comfortable.
Right. But even if they said that, I mean, this could be practiced in the breach, meaning, yeah, that's what should be, but it wasn't. In other words, I didn't follow your rules. The rules are to do this, this, and this, and I didn't follow the rules. So what now? Are we punishing him because he didn't follow the rules to do it the way you're saying? Or do we say,
the rule is that you can only put down collateral that is collectible at the same value as the loan?
But he didn't have a field worth $100. He had a field worth $200, and the loan was $100.
So the collateral,
he could have said,
is only $100 of that field.
Absolutely could have said it.
They could have made a general rule than having this.
Yeah,
I know what you're saying.
You're right. That's what they should do. But in reality, there was no such practice. And again, remember, the system there was not as it is today, where it's, you have uniformity and you have much more order and seder, and we understand that, you have laws, you have UCC, you have laws, this, that, the other. Things were much more back of the envelope. So if someone is saying to his friend, this is the way, here, I'm going to lend you $100 and you're pledging me the field, then again, you're right. If it was the Sudar and there was an order, he would have said, pledging you the field, but I'm only giving you $100 worth of the field, not the whole value. That would solve the problem. But we don't want to solve the problem. We want to create a discussion that tells us, how do you interpret things? Now, maybe this was an outlier. Maybe in most cases it was the way you say it, Jay, that they talked it out, they maybe wrote it down, whatever it was. But the Gemara here is trying to think, I guess, a little bit more broadly in saying, what if? What if? So if there's a what if, which the Gemara does all the time, then because with the what if, you begin to understand the svaras. If it's black and white, here's $100, here's a field, $100 worth of this field is yours, there's no wiggle room. That's what it is. But in order to understand, again, because this is a more deeper machlokes on the discussion of asmachta, the Gemara, intentionally says that this was the discussion between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nachman, or the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nachman, because of the ambiguity, because of the fact that there was no seder and no written, rule. This is what you should do. So, I mean, that's the way we have to look at it. That's the way we have to look at it. So now, here's the situation. Now, Rav Nachman now is more machmir than Rav Huna, and says that even in a case where there is, after the fact, he can take the whole field. So that's a bigger chiddush. Ovid Rav Nachman uvda. So Rav Nachman, who was a gadol at the time, he was an Amora, he ruled and he said in the following: Gabi Resh Galusa. The Resh Galusa was sort of the gadol ador, or the person that everybody followed, and he says the Rav Nachman Kishmaitza, that Rav Nachman said, according to his position, that there was a loan, and this was the circumstance, and the borrower defaulted, he didn't pay. So they came to Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman paskined, you can take the whole field, right? Because that's the shitasa. That's what his shita. His shita is you can take it. During or after the fact, you can take it. All right. Kara Rav Yehuda Lishmar. Now, Rav Yehuda was the Rosh Bezdin, in his Bezdin, and so the parties brought the document, in other words, the psak that Rav Nachman said that he has a right to the entire field. They brought it to Rav Yehuda to execute. And Rav Yehuda, he tore it up. He ripped up the psak from Rav Nachman, and he said, no, you can't. Amalei Resh Galusa. Now, the Resh Galusa, by the way, was the father-in-law of Rav Nachman. So the son of Rav Nachman was the son-in-law. So Amalei the Resh Galusa. So the Resh Galusa said to Rav Nachman, Rabbi Yehuda Kara l'shtarcha, that the Rabbi Yehuda tore up your psak. Like, what's going on? Amalei. So Rav Nachman said to the Resh Galusa, this is very interesting, Dardika Karye.
It was a kid that tore it up.
Was it like a child, a kid who tore it up? No, Gavra Rabba Karye. It was a great man, Rabbi Yehuda, who was the head of the Bezdin. So why did he tear it up? Tama the guy, why did he tear it up? Because he must have seen something in the psak that Rav Nachman gave that he didn't like, right? And what would that have been? It would have been that Rav Nachman gave him the entire field when he wasn't entitled to the entire field. So that is an incident that happened, and this was the exchange. So the Torah, this is a kasha on Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman made his statement, and now we see that it is not widely accepted, because you have to. Yehuda was there as the Av Bezdin, and he disagreed with him. So the Torah, that would be sort of a raya to Rav Huna, that Rav Huna is the one who's correct with regard to that situation where you, because remember, there's no machlokes. Rav Nachman agrees with Rav Huna that there would be no machlokes there. It's only after the fact whether or not you can make that pledge. Okay, that was the Gemara. Now, the second part is what I really want to get to is Ike de Amre. Others interpret the situation a little differently. Omar Le, Rav Nachman said to the Rosh Galusa, Dadika Karye. He didn't ask and say, was it a child? No, it was Rav Yehuda. He made a statement. He said, Dadika Karye. A child, obviously, that it wasn't a nice reference to Rav Yehuda. He says, who is he? He's a child who tear it up. Why? Now, lest you think that he was a person with a lot of hubris, the kula alma legabe didi bedina dadakanini, because everybody knows that I am the final psak in these matters of lending, of these matters. So this interpretation is saying, and again, I'm going back to this because of our discussion last week, also, Michael, that we had with Rav Huna, is that the halacha is like Rav Nachman, because the halacha is like Rav Nachman. That what? That he's more machmir, and Rav Nachman says that in all cases, whether it's in real time or after the fact, if you make that pledge, then even though asmachta lo kanya doesn't go away from the general rule, in this case, we, to your point, Jay, we look into his machshava and we say he meant to commit that field. It wasn't just puffery. It wasn't just, I'm doing it, first of all, after the fact, for sure, there's no reason why he would say it if he didn't mean it, because there's no reason to say it. So we said because he said it, he meant it. But so the halacha, so Nachman saying, everybody knows that I'm the pasuk when it comes to these matters of mamonos and others. Therefore, the halacha is like Rav Nachman, that there is no distinction if you make that commitment, whether you make it in real time or after the fact. In both cases, there is an assumption that he meant it, and therefore you can collect the entire field. Now, the question, which again is a separate question, is whether or not if and maybe the field was a choice field and it was, he wanted to have it, but the question is whether or not if he comes up with the money after the fact, can he redeem the field? Because the field has already gone over to the lender. But he says, oh no, I have the cash, whether or not he can redeem it. So we'll hold off on that for a little bit, but that's another question that comes up that we have to think about as to whether or not it's a valid argument. All right, so right now we're set. Machlokes is Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Halacha is like Rav Nachman. That Rav Nachman says that when you say it, you mean it. It's not. That in this particular case, the asmachta is there. It's strong. Now, we're not finished. Hoda Omer Rav Nachman. after all of this was said and done, comes Rab Nachman and he says, wait a minute. Rab Nachman is Machmir, right? He goes beyond Rav Huna and he says that it's binding after the fact. Comes Rav Nachman, Rav Nachman says, no, I'm wrong. Afilu b'shas matan mos lo kana v'lo klum. Even if it was done in real time, where he made the loan and he made the pledge, and the pledge was concurrent with the loan, lo kana v'lo klum, then he's saying, I thought about it, and no, this is a real asmachta. Because remember, we said asmachta lokanya, but this is an exception because we read his mind that he really meant to do it. Says Rav Nachman, no, I don't see any justification for saying that the asmachta, it is an asmachta, and therefore, in all instances, it's not controlling because he made the statement in support of the loan, but not with the intention of paying it. So Gemara doesn't go into what motivated Rav Nachman, but again, in real time, we're looking, again, Rav Nachman is the halacha, right? Because Rav Nachman is the one who we look to for halacha l'maisa, and here we thought that he was machmir well beyond Rav Huna, and he comes and retracts, and he says, no, not only am I not machmir more than Rav Huna, I am mekel even more than Rav Huna, because even in real time, where there's a pledge, you can't hold them to the pledge, and therefore asmachta lo kanya. Remember, this whole issue has to do with the concept of whether or not what you say has real meaning, or whether or not you're just saying it in support. And again, piggybacking on the Gemara that we had before, where we talked about whether or not if you make a statement, whether it's betume mila, whether it's just, okay, I said it just to say it, or whether you actually mean it. So this is, in a sense, a continuation of this Gemara, except here we're talking about something a little bit different. It's machta, but it's the same thought. Do words matter? In other words, we're always taught that, be careful what you say, because when you say something, that's what comes out of your mouth. That should be what should be looked at. Because again, to your point, Jay, how do I know what your machshava is? I don't know what your machshava is. The Rebbeinu Shalom knows your damn machshavas, not me. I don't know. So I only can go by what you say. So the Gemara is telling us here that there are certain, and again, this is going to be a fine line. How do you define when the asmachta, when it's really an asmachta or not an asmachta? So we're going to see in a minute that there are Tanoim who dispute these are the Amoraim, not from Yehuda, but there are Tanoim who dispute the underlying principle of asmachta, and there is one Tana who says asmachta kanya. We can't read your mind. If you say something, you mean it. So we'll see how that plays into the discussion. But at least
Rabbi,
with respect to the discussion of Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, asmachta lo kanya, and the halacha is like Rav Nachman, that again, to the point that we discussed last week, Michael, but what's halacha l'maisa? How do we deal with this? So we say the halacha in most cases where Rav Nachman is one of the disputants, that the halacha is like him, and therefore in this particular case we thought he was a machmer, he's really a mekel.
So what does he mean, asmachta lo kanya? Does that mean that the collateral has no impact at all at that point because he's not acquiring it? So what does it do to make that statement? Is it just ignored?
Yeah. So the principle of asmachta lo kanya is if two people engage in a transaction and they make a written commitment as to the transaction, you follow the written word, right? A shtar. That's the best form of proof of what the intention of the parties were, and you follow the shtar. no problem. What happens if there was not a shtar? And I lent you $100. And we didn't put a shtar. We didn't write it in the shtar. And I said to you, as a support for your comfort of lending me $100, I'm pledging this field. So in other words, now the parties are sort of negotiating outside the four corners of a shtar, which they should have, but they don't. So the question is, in a sense, do words matter or don't words matter? Because the only reason I said it, you wouldn't have given me the loan. So I had to, if I had said in the shtar that I'm writing down, I have a field and everything else, okay, fine. The lender knows there's a shtar and he can rely on it. But without having that written proof, can you rely on the person's word because he made the statement contiguous or in real time?
So, Rabbi, the case last week we discussed was there was no requirement from the lender that the borrower do this. So the borrower did it on his own. And the discussion was whether if he did it on his own in the beginning, when the loan was consummated, was it okay? And then when it was done later, after the loan, was it okay? So now we hear Rav Nachman has retracted that. So does that mean that the collateral has no impact on this lender?
No. What it means is, again, the collateral has validity to the amount of his loan.
Only to the amount of
his loan.
Okay.
Right. But if you're going to say, oh, I'm relying on his words because he said it in real time, therefore I should be entitled to the entire land, that we say we're not going to give him. So Rav Nachman originally said, no, even if it was said after the fact, it's also binding. And then he had a lightning bolt. He said, no, that doesn't work. In other words, what we're talking about now, it doesn't make sense. So he retracted, but he went so far as to say, not only after the fact, but even if the statement was made in real time, you can't hold him to that extra value because he didn't mean it.
So if he doesn't pay, the collateral is limited to the loan value, and that portion of the field that's equivalent to the loan value can substitute for repayment of the loan, but not the whole field.
Not the whole field.
Okay.
Right. So that's now we have a clear-cut machlokes between Nachman and Rav Huna. And okay, so machlokes. But again, we're not finished. Eisvei Rav Nachman. So now, after making this retraction, Rav Nachman made a retraction. Rava asked a kasha to Rav Nachman. He said, "Im ata noisen li mikan ba'ad shloshim yoim." Look at our Mishnah. Okay, that you're having a discussion. Let's go back to the Mishnah here, which we said earlier, which the Mishnah we quoted. Im ata noisen li mikan ba'ad shloshim shana, where the lender says, the Malva says to the Lova, if you don't pay me within the 3-year, I'm giving you a 3-year window, plenty of time to repay me. If you don't pay me within the 3-year window, then this particular field, Harihi Shalom, then it belongs to him, right? That's what the Mishnah says. So we see a Mishnah that specifically says that 3-year window, we hold him to it. You, Rav Nachman, are now retracting and saying that no, under no circumstance can we hold him to it, even if it was in real time. What are you going to do with our Mishnah? We have a Mishnah that says that if Malva lends to the Love with that condition of repayment in 3 years, Harihi Shalom. The Mishnah says Harihi Shalom. So how are you going to reconcile, Rav Nachman, your view that you now say all bets are off, there is no requirement of repaying the entire field, when the Mishnah, again, Reb Nachman was an Amora. So, he has to hang his hat somewhere, says the Mishnah, and yet you have this Mishnah that is clearly against his view. That was Rava's kasha on Reb Nachman. So very smartly, Amalei Reb Nachman says to Rava, Ani Omer Asmach Kanya. Okay, I used to say that Asmachta is Kanya. What does that mean, Asmachta Kanya? That when you make that pledge of the field, it wasn't just puffery, oh, I'm doing it to support the idea of the loan. I mean it. Asmachta Kanya, that if you say an Asmachta, meaning you say something like this, then Asmachta Kanya. That's why I said originally, under all circumstances, the pledge is a good pledge. In real time, after the fact, I was a machmir. But, and this is very interesting because we quoted Manyumi last week. Manyumi Omer Asmachta Lo Kanya. But Manyumi came along and he said Asmachta Lo Kanya, and he convinced me that I was wrong, which is why the Gemara says, so the Omer Rav Nachman retracted his view, and he said that it's never Kanya because he held like Manyumi. That was the reason why he made the change. So Rav Nachman is saying to Rava, what are you looking to me for? Go ask Manyumi. Manyumi is the one who says Asmachta Lo Kanya. I'm hanging my hat with him. You have a taina on me from the Mishnah. Go have a taina on Manyumi from the Mishnah. Because Manyumi was also an Amora, and he said to him, where do you come off saying it? He says, yeah, I hold like Manyumi. And so in other words, Nachman wants to deflect Rava's kasha because he asked it directly to Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman sort of pleaded and said, don't look to me. I once upon a time said Asmachta Kanya, and then I changed my mind because I was convinced by Menyumi that Asmachta Lo Kanya. And if Asmachta Lo Kanya, then it shouldn't matter whether it was in real time or not real time. In all circumstances, it's not Kanya. So he very, very astutely says, don't come to me, come to Menyumi. So the Gemara says, Menyumi kasha misnissen. Okay, so now he asks the kasha on Menyumi. Menyumi, you're saying that that Asmachta Lo Kanya, and therefore you're not tied. What are you going to do with the Mishnah? You have a Beferish Mishnah that says that if he doesn't repay in 3 years, Arihu Shalo, it belongs to him. So where do you come off, a generation or two later, changing what the Mishnah says? Again, we have a pecking order that, the Mishnah is resolute, and then the Amoraim come to explain the Mishnah. But here you're defying the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says that if everything's shalo, and you're saying no, it's not his. So how do we understand it? So now we're going to come to the point that I made, that now we have to look at the underlying principle of the Tanoim. This is no longer Machlokes Amoraim, Rav Huna, Rav Nachman, Menyamin. This is now Machlokes Tanoim. And there's two views. Iboyes Ema Masnissen Rav Yoisihi. So one alternative is to say, there are two Tanoim who argue this point of Asmachta. Rabbi Yossi says flat out Asmachta Kanya, and Rabbi Yehuda says Asmachta Lo Kanya, black and white. Rabbi Yehuda says that if you make an Asmachta, and again, to the point that you made, Michael, and everybody's asking, how do we look at someone's intention? What do we know what they're really thinking? So you don't know. So Rabbi Yossi says, if you utter the words, we're going to hold you to it. Asmachta Kanya. Even though it was a supporting a view, which means that even after the fact, even after the loan, where there's clearly no obligation to do anything because the loan's already happened. But if you make that statement, then it's a smachta, and Rabbi Yossi says a smachta kanya. However, the other view, Ben Yumi's view, is why? Because he holds like a Tana, which happens to be Rabbi Yehuda, who says asmachta lo kanya. So now we have a clear-cut difference in the actual principle of asmachta. So it's no longer a kasha if there's a Mishnah that says that it belongs to him. That Mishnah follows Rabbi Yossi. In other words, you can have among the Tanoim a discussion, and you can have two sides. And one side will say one thing, and one side will say other, and there will be those who fall behind one of the views, and those who go behind the other view, and that'll be the machlokes. And again, it's the machlokes tanoim. So at that point, if you can't resolve it, then we have the famous teku, right? Because if you can't resolve the shaila, then we have to leave the shaila until later, till Mashiach. So this is one answer. That Mishnah follows Rabbi Yossi, right? Who says asmachta kanya. But Manuma says asmachta lo kanya, and therefore I'm holding Rav Nachman saying I'm holding like Manumi that asmachta lo kanya. All right, that's one teretz. But now Iboyis Amo. Now, so the Gemara wants to change what you said just a little bit. Change the case just a little bit.
Rabbi Grauman.
Good morning, Tzvi. Good morning.
Could you please go back to Isebe Rava, Rav Nachman? I missed what you said.
Yeah. So Rava asked Rav Nachman Akasha. Rav Nachman, you just retracted your statement, and you said that in all cases, like kana v'lo klum, whether it was in real time or after the fact, if you make an asmachta, that asmachta is never interpreted as a commitment. It's looked at as, okay, he said it because he wanted to give the fellow comfort in order to make the loan, but he didn't mean it. So Rav Nachman is retracting from being a machmir to being a makel, and he's saying that's my view. Says Rava asks the kasha, Rav Nachman, you're coming to be a makel. We have a Mishnah that is exactly against you. Right? We have a Mishnah that says, and the Gemara says, and the Mishnah says, black and white. If you don't pay me in 3 years, money is mine. And the Mishnah says, he didn't pay him in 3 years, harihu shalo. So if it's harihu shalo, how can Rav Nachman, who's an Amora, make the point that no, I'm makel. You can't be makel when we have Tanoim who say that this is the halacha. That's the way we look at Chazal and halacha. So how are we going to reconcile Rav Nachman? So Rav Nachman wanted to wiggle out of it by saying, you know what, I really believe asmachta kanya, but I changed my mind. And Menumi changed my mind. He gave me enough ammunition to believe that asmachta lo kanya, and this is all asmachta. I mean, he was an Adam Gadol. Rav Nachman was the posting hadar, and so, but he went ahead and said, "Manuma changed my mind." So then the Gemara says, "Okay, Manuma, why isn't it a kasha?" Okay, Rav Nachman is relying on Manuma. Why is it not a kasha on Manuma, who says opposite to Manuma, who is also an Amora? So how can Manuma say something that the Mishnah doesn't agree with? Same question, except now we shifted from the Nachman to Menumin. So one teretz the Gemara wants to give is no. There's a clear-cut machlokis tanoim, whether asmachta kanya or asmachta lo kanya. Now, clearly the majority view is asmachta lo kanya. That is the majority view. And that's the halacha. We follow Rav Nachman. That's the halacha. But there is another Tana, and we'll talk a minute about it. It happens to be Rabbi Yehuda, who says the Smachta Lo Kanya. And therefore, Manume held like that Tana, and Manume convinced Rav Nachman to hold like that position, that asmachta lo kanya, and therefore he retracted from being a total machmir to a total makel, because of that view. We're going to see that view in a minute because it goes back to something we've said before. Okay, so that's one view. And here you don't have to make any changes to the lashon. Everything is good because it's really a question of whether or not which Tana you follow. But there's an avoyas ema, and we've had this so many times that we know that when you are learning the Gemara, you sometimes see something that you overlook. Avoyas ema. So the second interpretation is, no, the Mishnah didn't mean that if I lend you the money and you made the pledge, that it's an asmachta, and therefore when the time comes, you don't pay, it belongs to me. That's not what's happening here. The omale kona ma'achshav. This word ma'achshav changes the circumstance. Here you have a lender and a borrower, and the borrower says to the lender, kona ma'achshav, you are kona my land now, as we make the loan, right? So if I don't repay it, you already own it. In other words, you owned it 3 years ago. So there's no question of asmachta anymore. He's giving him the land, and he's saying, in exchange for the loan, this is your land. In a sense, it's no longer a loan, it's a sale. And we've had that before, right? We've seen before the Gemara says, oh, we make a loan. No, it's not a loan, it's a sale. And therefore, there's not the ribis issue didn't apply because he made a direct sale. Here too, says the Gemara, that's what the Mishnah means. Therefore, it's not a subject of asmachta. I can really hold asmachta lo kanya. But here there's no asmachta. He sold it to him. What was the condition? The condition was that if I repay it, if I repay you within 3 years, you'll sell me back the land. Right? So that, in other words, it'll trigger an automatic sale of the land if I repay you.
But
So
how can you have that sale?
We're interpreting this Gemara with different facts. We're saying the facts here are that he sold him the land, then there's no more asmachta issue.
But there's no kinyan, there's nothing else related to a sale.
That's a good point. We're going to get to that in a minute because the Rishonim discuss what do you do with a kinyan, right? To your point,
Yeah.
Where's the kinyan? There's got to be a kinyan. All right, we'll get to that in a minute. But you see that this avoyas ema is changing the terms of the discussion. In other words, we're taking it out of the parsha of asmachta entirely, and we're saying it was an outright sale. After the fact, in other words, Hoover double mafreya, if I don't pay you, that sale was actually established 3 years ago. But if I repay you, then the condition is, and that condition doesn't, okay, we're going to see how it affects ribis in a minute, but that condition is a valid condition in contract law. In other words, in contract law, you can make such a shtar. You can say,
So what happens to the payrus?
That's the question. That's the next point, because there's going to be the subject of ribis.
I really didn't look at it.
We haven't discussed ribis yet. We're talking asmachta, but that's going to be the shaila. What happens with the food of the field over the course of the 3 years? So, all right. So let's set the stage. One teretz is it's a machlokes tanoim, asmachta kanya, asmachta lo kanya. And the second view is, no, everybody holds asmachta lo kanya, which is the majority view. But our case is not a case of asmachta. It's a case of a sale with a trigger that it can be repaid after the 3 years. In which case, there's no longer a kasha here, because Menyame was saying, in this particular case, you know what? The case of the Mishnah is not my case. My case is the regular case we're talking about here. The case of the Mishnah was where they made a sale. And when they made a sale, it's not comparable to asmachta, but you could really say asmachta lo kanya, and therefore Rav Nachman halachically is correct because he relied on Menuhin. And therefore Rava's kasha is not a kasha because it's two different worlds. One is the world of asmachta, according to the Boyas Ema, and one is the world of a sale, and they're not the same. All right. So again, the Gemara was looking for different ways. You had those Amoraim who looked at the case and said, and again, it would be nice to be a fly on the wall to hear the discussion, because here they're having a discussion about asmachta, and then I don't know if it was a Tana or more than one Tana comes and says, wait a minute, that Mishnah that we're discussing here has nothing to do with asmachta. So the other Tanoim were, all right, so we're going to establish a Mishnah, and the Mishnah says that after 3 years, Harihu Shalo, everything fine and good. Why is it his? Because he bought it. It was never contingent on the repayment. If he repays, then the sale goes back, but otherwise the sale doesn't go back. So that is an interesting twist here the Gemara gives us, and we're going to
when we talk about intentions, and they're trying to derive what through these various techniques, the lender didn't sell. I mean, how can a lender he needs to borrow $100, so he sells his whole field to somebody who gives him $100? He should get the full value of the field if he sold it to the lender.
Right. Jay, there's no getting around it. I mean, on the plain facts, it's a little bit of a stretch, right? Because why would people engage?
Why would they behave this way?
So the Gemara is not necessarily okay. Well, there was a case that came to Rav Nachman, so it was a real case. But different people do different things. So the Gemara, it'd be easier enough if your case was the case of the Gemara here. It's pretty straightforward. There's no issue. But the Gemara is stretching our thinking and is saying, you know what?
Okay.
This is the norm.
So it's a theoretical discussion.
If you don't do what's the norm, you don't do what's the norm. Okay? For whatever reason. I mean, I don't know why someone would do it. You wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. No one would do it. But someone did it. What do we say when someone does it? Does it mean that he committed or not committed? So you can't ask the question, why didn't he? He should have, but he didn't. So then the Gemara now has this whole discussion based on the fact that someone did something which normally people wouldn't do. Do we hold him to it? Did he step into it and we say, you made your bed, now sleep in it? That's the question. So the Gemara wants us to understand that when you stretch the thinking, that's where this whole discussion comes in. Is it a smachta? Is it not a smachta? And if it's not an asmachta, I mean, if it is an asmachta, then are there circumstances in which you can still own it? So that's the two versions. The Ikad Amre, the Borisema, is that one version says it strictly follows the views of the Tanoim, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, and that's it. Those are the views. Or you can say no. We don't really asmachta lo kanya, except that in a particular case where the facts don't follow exactly to what an asmachta is, as was the case in the Mishnah, we say, where he said me'achshav, then it falls out of an asmachta. So what does that tell us? That asmachta lo kanya. If you're doing an asmachta, it wasn't meant seriously. Why does the Mishnah say kana shalo? Because it's not an asmachta. And it's just like the first version says, there's a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda as to whether an asmachta is kanya, whether an actual asmachta is kanya, and Rabbi Yossi says it is, and Rabbi Yehuda says it isn't. The Iboyas Amos says, no, I don't have to come on to that discussion. Why? Because in the case of the Mishnah, we're not even talking about an asmachta. So the question of asmachta kanya or not, we'll leave that for another day. But this Mishnah is not a stira to Rav Nachman, because the Mishnah is talking about one set of facts, And Rav Nachman, in his case, the case that came before him in Bezdin, or the case that came before him, was a different situation where there wasn't a smachta. So again, different ways of looking and understanding the Gemara. But okay, so you asked the question, Jay, and it's a very good question. The question is, was there a kinyan? I mean, we know that metaltalin, you make a kinyan, hagbah, mashit, or whatever. For land, you can't lift it, you can't push it, you can't pull it. So if there is an exchange of money, there has to be a kinyan. We say Kabbalah's kinyan, you pick up a handkerchief, a cloth, whatever, and you're mekabel kinyan for something that you can't otherwise move. So that there's a machlokes. There's actual machlokes rishonim, and one view holds that Rav Huna's case, where Rav Huna started and they talked about the Kona HaKol, that's only with a kinyan. In other words, we're assuming there was a kinyan. If there wasn't a kinyan, it wouldn't work. But we're assuming there was a kinyan, and therefore it works. So according to this shita, you really have an issue where you have to check, was there a kinyan? Because if there wasn't a kinyan, then it's nothing. The other view states you don't need a kinyan. Why? Because when you make the statement that to the lender, and you say to him, I'm pledging this property to you, it's as if he put it into his possession. Not like the Gemara says later, what we've just learned, where he says me'achshav. No, you don't have to say me'achshav. Even in a regular case of asmachta, the fact that he pledged it, says the Rishonim, means it is now in the possession. That pledge makes the kinyan. So we don't need a kinyan. According to this view, we don't need a kinyan, an actual kinyan, because by making the pledge, you're putting it into his possession. Now, if you wind up repaying, okay, then you get it back. But it's similar but not identical to what we just said in the Mishnah, right? We say in the Mishnah that he said me'achshav, which means that he actually sold it to him. This view doesn't say I sold it to you. It means I pledged it to you, and the kinyan is the fact that you are now taking this property, even if there wasn't a physical kinyan. So the machlokes here is, do you need a physical kinyan or not? So some Rishonim say you need a physical kinyan, otherwise you can't go. And the other Rishonim say, no, you don't need a physical kinyan. A verbal kinyan, in the case where you're making that commitment, it's as if you already put it in his possession, so that he is now the owner, subject to it being repaid, and therefore it'll come back to him. So this is an interesting discussion. Can you have a Kabbalah's kinyan just through the? We always assume that you have to have an actual kinyan, but in this particular fact situation, says a number of the Rishonim that you don't have to have an actual kinyan. It's a virtual kinyan by the fact that you transferred, with your words, you transferred into his possession, subject to your repaying. It's a little different than selling it to him, but it's the same thought. Okay, it's the same thought that he now has control. And if you have control, then okay, you're the balabos. So, you get it. That's it. I'm the balabos now. So anyway, that's the thinking as to what in the machlokes why you do or don't have to have a kinyan, is because one Manda Amar holds that there actually has to be a kinyan, and the other Manda Amar holds that there's such a thing as a virtual kinyan by the mere fact that he pledged it to him. Because normally, if I transact with you, I have to be Makabel Kinyan. Let's say you sold me a field, right? I have to be Makabel Kinyan. Otherwise, the transaction doesn't complete. The Chiddush here is he made the pledge. It wasn't just you and I transacting. We are making a transaction with a pledge. That's the Kinyan. The pledge becomes the Kinyan that transfers it to the Malveh, and therefore he is really in control. When the 3 years come, he doesn't have to do anything more. It was all done at the time of the loan. So in any event, that's an interesting discussion on whether or not a Kinyan is required or not. But back to our Gemara, we want to conclude with something. So we're still talking Asmachta, right? We're still talking Asmachta. So it says the Gemara weiter. Now we're talking about the Asmachta from our Mishnah. Amalei ma Yenuka ma Kashusha b'nei Rav Chizda. These are the sons of Rav Chizda said to Rav Ashi. What did they say to him? Hacha Amir Nardoi Mishmei Rav Nachman. And Nardoi was the center of Torah. So in Nardoi, they said in the name of Rav Nachman, Hay Asmachta b'zman Kanya below zman lo Kanya. So this is different than what we just said. They're saying in Nardoi, quoting Rav Nachman, that Rav Nachman really is taking Rav Huna's position. Hi, asmachta, bismane kanya. If it's done during real time, it's kona. Below zmanya, lo kanya. But if it's in a different time, it's not kona. So according to this view, Rav Nachman is really saying the same thing as Rav Huna. Omalei, Rav Ashi said to both of them, Kol midi bismane koni. So he makes a statement and he says, everything in its time, it's a little, we have to understand what he means. Everything in its time is kana, below zimne, low kana. But if it's not in its time, then it's not kana.
Means simultaneous. Is that what you meant?
Right. So we don't understand. Right now, with this statement, there's an ambiguity. What does this mean? He made a statement. The statement says, everything, everything that's done at the time it should be done, generically, let's talk generically, is kana. Below zmane, but not in its time, it's not kana. So, what is he saying? I mean, that's pretty obvious. If it's done in time, it's kana. If it's not done in time, it's not kana. What is
What are they referring to?
Answering to this kasha? The kasha is, in Nardoi, they said that Rav Nachman said, it all depends on when the asmachta was given, in bizmane kone, below zmane lo kane. But what I mean, that's so obvious. What's the chiddush here? What does he mean to say? In other words, okay, the kasha is the kasha. We have to, the answer is better than the kasha. So so in their doi they said this. So the kasha is what was he saying? What was he meaning by saying that? Says the Gemara, Dilma Hocha Kamartin. This is what Rav Nachman meant to say when you quoted Rav Nachman. And you said in Nardoi, they said this, that this is what they meant to say. And again, it's a little bit different, different twist than what we understand the Gemara. Ashkechei b'goy zimna b'amalei kanei. There was a transaction, okay? And the lender said, the borrower said to the lender, I'll give you this field if I don't repay. And then within the 3 years, he said to the lender, Kone, you can buy the field. Kone, you can buy the field. What does that mean? It means that he wasn't going to live up to the commitment of paying in 3 years. So if he says kone before the time, then kone. So when it says below kol mida bismane kone, he means to say not what we think it is, but if you make the transaction and within the time of the transaction you say to the lender kone, then you might have a havamina, and that doesn't mean anything because you can still undo it at the end of the 3 years. So the Gemara is saying, no, if he says kane, he has shown his intent that it's not an asmachta and that he really wants the lender to buy it.
To buy
That's
it,
what it
right?
means.
He doesn't. He wants to sell it to the lender.
He wants to sell it to the lender, exactly.
In the middle of all of this, he says,
Exactly.
I'm taking back my collateral, but you can buy it if you want to buy my collateral.
Kane, no, he's saying Kane, that pledge that I made, I'm selling to you. In other words, according to this,
But no,
he
wants
would
to
be-
get a new sale here.
no, he was going to actually sell him the land worth more than the loan. He was going to sell that to him
For $100?
for $100, exactly. So it's a different understanding that there was no reason for him to say it. Again, remember, this whole discussion is this an asmachta, is not an asmachta? The Gemara wants to try to make us understand, and your question, Jay, what's the intention? How do we know what the intention is? If someone doesn't verbalize what he wants to do,
You're not sure.
there's an ambiguity of what he really thinks.
Yeah.
Says the Gemara that in this particular case, okay, normally asmachta lo kan, but if, and this is what Ravashi said, kol mide b'zmane kone, if in the zman, meaning in the 3 years, he says to the lender, kone, buy it, it's yours, and he buys it, even though there's an imbalance of the value of the land and the loan, he's actually selling it to him. However, Basar Zimne, if after the 3 years, Amale Kane, the borrower comes to the seller, to the lender, and he says the same thing, Kane. He hasn't repaid him on the loan, but he says Kane, which you would think means, oh, his machshava is, go take it, it's yours. Then under that circumstance, lo Kane. In other words, that's the chilik here that Reb Nachman, we're not talking about the classic case of whether or not asmachta kanya, asmachta lo kanya, where Reb Nachman changed his mind and he went to the kula. We're talking about a different circumstance. The circumstance was that he made the loan and he pledged it to him and to repay in 3 years. So typically we would say asmachta lo kanya, because that's the ruling, that's the law. But now the borrower in the middle says to the lender, Kone, you can acquire it, meaning that which you now have in your hands is Kone. Says Rav Nachman, that's what they're interpreting, that's what Rav Nachman says, that under those circumstances, it's no longer an asmachta, because an asmachta is, remember, an asmachta has a certain vagary to it, because you're saying something without knowing the reality, right? That's what asmachta is. Do we say that it's a puffery? Do we say he means it? But when he says kone, you take it out of the parsha of asmachta, and now you're saying it's an actual transaction. In that case, Rav Nachman says, of course, I agree that you can do that because it's not an asmachta issue. However, if you do it not in real time, meaning below zimne, this is what he said below zimne, lo kane, because then I say it's an asmachta. If you're going to do it after the fact, after the loan is done, and he's going to say to him, kane, says Rav Nachman, no, under no circumstance can I interpret that to mean that he's selling him the land. Why? Machmas kisufa hudu ka'amale, because he is embarrassed. He is ashamed of the fact that he didn't pay it on time. So he's making this sort of, it's a throwaway statement. Oh, you can take my field. You can have my field. He didn't mean it. So Rav Nachman is interpreting his machshava, okay, his thinking, he's interpreting to say that if in real time you say kone, it means kone, it's not an asmachta. If you say kone after the fact, then it's not really kone, because why? Below zimna lo kone, that's what Rashi is saying. They said in their doi, that's what they meant in Rav Nachman. Below zimna lo kone, if it's after the fact, it's not kone, because the only reason he said it was to avoid the embarrassment. He was embarrassed that he didn't pay him. So he says, "Oh, go ahead and take it. It's not a problem." So again, this is another twist. It's another twist on the whole shaila of whether or not asmachta kanya, asmachta lo kanya. So we're going to stop here, even though the Gemara goes back, but I want to finish with one thought, because I know it was Jay or someone asked, what about ribbis? Okay, this issue of smachta, we're not talking about ribbis. But if he gave him the field, and according to the boys Amor, he gave it to him me'achsha. He sold him the field. But he has a right of retraction. Then what should you do? So the answer is you have to give it to a third party, because when you make a sale conditional on the opportunity to buy it back, then that's where the ribbis question will come in, because if you don't buy it back, no problem. The lender can eat it. If you buy it back, it doesn't belong to the lender. It should
Where's the
belong to the buyer.
You're buying it back for the value that you owned it already.
Yeah, but meantime, the lender ate the produce. That would be ribbis. So the question is, if you don't give it to the third party, then it could be ribbis, because if I sell it to you conditionally that I can buy it back, we don't know until 3 years later if I'm buying it back or not. If I'm not buying it back and you ate from the field, no problem. But if you ate from the field and I'm buying it back, then what you ate for 3 years is ribbis. It's classic ribbis, because you got to benefit from this transaction, which was not agreed upon. However,
put in the third party's name.
No, but here's the beauty of it. Except if you hold like Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says, Tzad achas beribis, that if there are optional sides of whether or not something is ribbis or not ribbis, then you can eat it and it's not ribbis. Remember, Rabbi Yehuda in the past said to us that in circumstances where you have an option to exercise an option, like in this case, I can exercise an option to rebuy it or not. Whenever you can exercise an option, you can't have ribbis. Ribbis is, in other words, classic. I give you, I take an extra portion, it's ribbis. But where that extra portion is up in the air as to whether or not it's actually going to happen, Rabbi Yehuda says can never have ribbis. So that, in other words, that's the kula and ribbis according to Rabbi Yehuda. So in this particular case, he would not have to give it to the shlish. He can eat it. Why can he eat it? Because what's the worst that's going to happen? The guy's going to buy it back. Okay, he exercised the right to buy it back, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, that doesn't make ribbis. Exercising the right to buy back later doesn't introduce ribbis during the 3 years that he was eating the property. So again, we see how full circle it comes back. And again, Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says asmachta lo kanya, right? He argues with Rabbi Yosef, but he also gives us this chiddush, which it's amazing chiddush, is tzad achas beribis, that if there are two sides, meaning one side of ribbis and one side is not ribbis, then the ribbis side, if you exercise the ribbis side, it's not ribbis because you had an option to do the non-ribbis side.
Yeah.
That's an interesting twist here. But in any event, what we see from all of this Gemara is, again, Rab Nachman is the Paisik. We hold it Rab Nachman. Rab Nachman is Mekel. But there are circumstances where, depending on the nuance of what you say, whether it's me'achshav or whether, as in this particular case of Nardoi, he said kone in the middle of the transaction. Again, this is all meant to sort of broaden our thinking, because all of this happens because people don't do precisely what we think they should do, right? Write a star, bingo, nothing happens. Where would the fun be if it was done so straightforwardly? The whole Gemara is because it opens up the possibilities when you don't do it the way, maybe the simple way that it should be done. There is a halacha. We don't just brush it off and say, no, okay, you didn't do it right, so you lose. No, you don't lose, because then this whole concept of asmachta comes in, and then we see that the rules of asmachta govern. Even when it comes to ribbis, we say that asmachta lo kanya, but there's no ribbis because of Rabbi Yehuda. If you don't hold like Rabbi Yehuda, then there's ribbis. But we hold like Rabbi Yehuda that when there's an option in a case like here, if he exercises the option, then he gets it back, then it might be ribbis. If he doesn't exercise the option, it clearly wouldn't be ribbis. Then we're makel, and we say we don't treat it as ribbis, even though if he exercised the option, it would be, but we say no, it's not ribbis.